So you heard the Gospel of John's version of the resurrection story. Here's the part you didn't hear. It was following the resurrection, and the disciples were still somewhat scattered around Jerusalem and the surrounding villages. John, the unnamed disciple from the Gospel of John, he finds Peter, and he runs up to him, and he's very excited, and he says, Peter, I've got some good news, and I've got some bad news. Peter takes hold of John and calms him down. Take it easy, John. What is it? What's the good news? And John says, the good news is Christ is risen today. Well, Peter says, that's great. But what's the bad news? Well, John, looking around, says, he's really peeved about last Friday. Do you think Jesus took it personally? I can't imagine getting executed and not taking it personally. I mean, if someone just gives me the stink eye, I take it a little personally. And if you don't know what a stink eye is, you're just not paying attention. Seriously. Last week, I talked about some of the things that people say when they're being passive-aggressive, and one phrase that I left out, didn't mention, is this. Please don't take this personally, but if someone begins a sentence like that, you know you're about to be insulted. On the other hand, have you ever noticed how no one ever says, please take this personally? And yet that's exactly what our faith tradition is telling us today. Please take this personally because this is about you and me today. Now I'm talking about the resurrection story. On the surface, the resurrection story is really only about Jesus. Christ the Lord is risen, not Jimmy Watson. Jesus Christ is risen today, not any of you. Christ arose, not your deceased loved ones. The story is about Jesus, not about us, just Jesus. And that's why my attention turned this year to the very brief reading from the letter to the Colossians. Everyone always focuses on the gospel reading, of course, because it is the actual story, the story of Jesus' resurrection. But maybe I'm feeling a little too narcissistic this year, because as I read the words from Colossians, it felt more personal in a good way. A quick note about the letter to the Colossians before I continue. Although our Bibles refer to it as Paul's letter to the Colossians, it is unlikely that he was the actual author. Scholars generally refer to Colossians as a post-Pauline letter. Somebody wrote it later on. Nevertheless, it was almost certainly a man who wrote the letter because of the patriarchal world in which it was written. So I will refer to the author as he. And I hope by doing so that I will not lose my membership in the politically correct club that I belong to. But it was a he. And in chapter 3, he begins by telling the Colossians that they have been raised with Christ. Imagine hearing that and you haven't yet died. They have been raised with Christ. This really caught my attention. The writer is making the resurrection of Jesus Christ personal for them. Well, how does he do that? How does he pull that off? I'm going to use a sports analogy to explain what I think he's trying to say. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the Cardinals win the World Series this year. Could happen. Nobody's laughing, right? Could happen. Afterwards, people from St. Louis will say, we won the World Series. Because the fate of the team and the fate of the fans are one and the same, although the team is the actual winner of the World Series. And that's sort of what the writer is trying to say here. He is linking our fate with Jesus' fate. He won, so we win. We have been raised with Christ, he says. This is personal. Now, if I may employ a little alliteration for a moment. This is also present tense. It's not just personal, but it's present tense. He's talking about the resurrection for you and me in the here and now when he tells his readers, to seek the things that are above. Now think about it. One doesn't seek anything if one is on the other side of the grave. One only seeks when they are on this side of the grave. So if you have been raised with Christ in the past, seek the things that are above in the present. Now, does this mean that we are to seek the stars and look for new planets and gaze through the Hubble telescope or hop on a ship to Mars? Are the astronomers and astronauts, the cosmologists and the cosmonauts a little more spiritual than the rest of us simply because they have the technological ability to seek things that are above? Well, of course not. We should not take the word above literally in this case, because in the ancient world, people didn't know what we know today. They believed that God and God's realm were physically above those of us who live on a flat earth. And although today we might raise our heads in a posture of prayer or point to the sky, thanking God for something, most of us understand that God is not literally up there. We no longer share that worldview. And nor is Jesus physically and literally seated on some throne at the right hand of God, as the writer says, up there in outer space. If he is, wouldn't it be cool someday if the Hubble telescope caught a glimpse of Jesus sitting on that throne? It's not going to happen, okay? To say that Jesus is seated at the right hand of God is simply a reference to royalty. It's an image that they had at their disposal in the ancient world. And so, for lack of a better word, Jesus is the prince of the universe, and he's sitting next to the king of the universe. Again, royalty was the best category they had in that days, and therefore it is the writer's way of paying Jesus the highest amount of homage. So, here's what we know about the resurrection so far from the perspective of the writer of Colossians. Remember, he's talking about us being raised with Christ. The resurrection is personal. It is in the present and not just in the past. And it links our fate with the Prince of the universe. And that is 3 times I use the letter P, and I'm pretty sure that reaches the maximum, amount that one is allowed to do alliteration. However, I think I see another possible P in this. It seems to me that the writer is also telling us that the resurrection can be practiced. Now, I know that sounds like a very odd thing to say. How can one practice resurrection? Well, here's my odd answer. We practice resurrection when we pass the bar. I guess I just added another P, right? We practice the resurrection when we pass the bar. How many of you have ever practiced law? Have anybody in here practiced law? No? But you know what you do you know what you have to do to practice law, right? You have to pass the bar exam. When the writer of Colossians says, "So if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above," he's making a poetic reference to rising above the law, and in this case, the law of Moses, and then subsequent laws that came into being for the Israelites and the Jews after that. These were laws, and I'm generalizing here, but these were laws that told people what they could or could not touch or taste. It sounds sort of petty, does it not? But that's what they were. And in the previous verses in Colossians, the writer claims that the law, the Mosaic law, has no value in checking self-indulgence. Think about that. Has no value in checking self-indulgence. In other words, a law-based religion doesn't work. It cannot work because we can never pass the bar that has been set so high for us, not by ourselves anyway. And so therefore, resurrection is code for passing the bar. Jesus passed the bar for us, and he gave us the cheat sheet. The resurrection frees us to practice the faith and seek the things that are above the law, to go beyond the law. That's sort of the essence of the New Testament gospel, is it not? It's interesting that we often criticize people in our society, especially important people, who think that they are above the law. No one is above the law, we say, not even presidents or prime ministers or princes, and I apologize because I'm using so many P's. And yet, theologically speaking, you and I, since we have been raised with Christ, we are above the law. We have passed the bar, a bar that was set higher than a pole vaulter's nightmare. And now we can practice the faith by seeking the things that are above. Do you feel a little high right now? I do, because I'm way up here. That was bad, wasn't it, Dwayne? Can we wrap our heads around the practical implications of the resurrection? And again, too many P's, I know. Can we grasp the notion that the resurrection is personal, it's in the present, and it links us with the Prince? Can we fully understand the possibility that we can pass the bar and practice the resurrection? So if you've been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. That might sound perplexing at first, but it is the promise of our faith. If I keep doing the P's, I'm going to start spitting and Jesus would be peeved. So I'm not going to do that. But I'm going to package this up with a prayerful reflection on the practical implications of the resurrection. I apologize. This was written by Gerard Kelly. It is called, Because He is Risen. Because He is risen, spring is possible in all the cold, hard places gripped by winter, and freedom jumps the queue to take fear's place as our focus. Because He is risen. Because He is risen, my future is an epic novel. Where once it was a mere short story, my contract on life is renewed in perpetuity. My options are open-ended. My travel plans are cosmic. Because He is risen. Because He is risen, healing is on order and assured, and every disability will bow before the endless dance of His ability. And my grave too will open when my life is restored, for this frail and fragile body will not be the final word on my condition, because He is risen. Because He is risen, hunger will go begging in the streets for want of a home, and selfishness will have a shortened shelf life, and we will throng to the funeral of famine and dance on the callous grave of war, and poverty will be history in our history, because He is risen. And because He is risen, a fire burns in my bones, and my eyes see possibilities, and my heart hears hope like a whisper on the wind. And the song that rises in me will not be silenced as life disrupts this shadowed place of death like a butterfly under the skin. And death itself runs terrified to hide because He is risen. Amen.